read kind of an excerpted version of my reflection paper, and then kind of abbreviated introduction, an abbreviated analysis of the picture of Dorian Gray, and then an abbreviated conclusion. Yeah. So while teaching English 102 this semester, I finally learned from the 12th chapter of Jodi Nikotra's Becoming Rhetorical that to begin a research paper while already knowing what one plans to say is a recipe for disaster. I wouldn't go so far as to say that I broke this rule, but I may have come close. So even before I began working on my master's degree, I knew that my final writing sample was going to be about gender in rock music. Though I've succeeded in educating myself in the reasons for the prominence of gender play in the music industry, I found that the unifying argument in a very unexpected place, the work of Oscar Wilde. My interest in Wilde began after I graduated with my bachelor's degree, and I was hoping to find some time to work on more creative projects. I believe it was during a session of self-loathing songwriting and sending desperate booking emails from a happy sunlit window at One World Cafe that I ran into an old acquaintance from my Shakespeare class. We got to talking, and he told me that our mutual acquaintance who I knew from a songwriting class was also looking for a collaborator to write a musical. This would be perfect for me, as my ultimate goal was to follow the trajectory of legendary goth rocker Danny Elfman, who began as the frontman for Oingo Boingo of Weird Science fame. And for those of you who don't know, Elfman eventually joined forces with Tim Burton to become his go-to film score composer, and is recently credited with scoring the film adaptations of the 50 Shades of Grey book sequels. The play would be an adaptation of the picture of Dorian Gray, set in modern-day Portland or Seattle. My new collaborator and former theater arts major would write the play, and I'd write the songs. And as I immersed myself in the work, I became interested in the ways that it dealt with social, sexual, and religious anxieties with humorously profound witticisms. I was also surprised to find references to the symbolists who had fallen in love with in college via a class on, via my Western literature survey class. I was seduced by Baudelaire's description of a carcass, and it reinvigorated my love of darkness in literature. While I'd liked Poe for his aesthetic, there was something more at stake with the Gothic aesthetic in Baudelaire. His direct confrontations with fear and the grotesque seemed to suggest that the agency that I lacked could only be gained by similarly confronting that which I had been taught and conditioned to avoid. The connections between Wilde and other writers that I had loved cemented his work in my memory. And around this same time, I was also working with my own band, and I had recently noticed the fairly obvious trend of androgynous frontmen in rock bands, and I was frustrated with the fact that androgynous frontmen like Mick Jagger, Robert Plant, and the scruffy yet moody, dress-wearing Kurt Cobain had over time become accepted as masculine figures as their group gained mass popularity. One night, my bassist and I were having beers at our local ale house, and I mentioned this observation. We continued to discuss it over a couple of very masculine 22-ounce mugs. And my curiosity grew and eventually became my main motivation for going to graduate school. That and Jen Ladina's persuasion tactics. My first semester landed me in a class about bodies as sites of rhetoric. As excited as I was to connect all of my areas of interest in one paper, I was determined to find a way to make this subject fit the class. This justification pitted my weak undergraduate rhetorical skills against Jodi Nikotra, Titan of Rhetoric, who we all know literally wrote the textbook on rhetoric. It was a hard fight, but I came out victorious. Kind of.
I was vanquished.
Vanquished. Yes. As my first paper evolved in response to the conversation in the class, Jodi pushed me more and more towards looking at the circulation of iconography as it relates to rock musicians. This eventually challenged me to define the nature of an icon, but it also brought me back to my old friend Oscar Wilde, who was referenced throughout many of the sources that I used to develop my final piece on the iconic rock dandy. In my second semester, I had to satisfy the requirement of taking pre-1900 literature class. So if you'll hold the rotten fruit when I confess that I was not the biggest fan of Victorian literature at the time. My perception had been jaded by bad film misinterpretations of Jane Austen and the Brontes, as well as my own mistake of placing Jane Austen in the wrong time period. Thank you, Tara. I had been force-fed many of these films by my mother through most of my childhood, and they were presented to me with a culturally fetishistic attitude and romanticization that made me gag. The artifice and gaudy aesthetic were presented without the irony necessary to appeal to a sarcastic and snotty punk. I determined early in my second semester of graduate school that the best way to survive would be to focus on Oscar Wilde, one of the few Victorian writers who I had come to love for his irony. And it helped that I had already done a fair amount of research on him. So through my work on Wilde, I was able to extract his theories of dandyism and trace them to musicians today, and found his influence surprisingly prevalent in the image and work of Josh Tillman or Father John Misty. Okay, so this is from my intro. Because of the real-world consequences of crafting an online identity, many of us associate our online identity with our conscious selves and our subjectively limited understandings of ourselves as individuals. We may try to shape public perception based on subjective understanding and end up taking things personally that have nothing to do with our personhood. We ignore the fact that the images and words that represent us online circulate and take on lives of their own, independent of our conscious interaction with them. As Donna Haraway says of her cyborgs, we are all chimeras, condensed images of both imagination and material reality. So in this paper, I propose that we acknowledge the imaginary and independent lives of our identities in the interest of taking a new approach. Beginning with Victorian dandy and queer writer Oscar Wilde, I adapt Donna Haraway's theory of the cyborg to look at dandyism as a Victorian invention that creates a deliberate schism between the self and the image of the self. This in turn increases the individual's agency by means of illusion when physically embodied interactions with others. When in physically embodied interactions, others come to see the signifying image as inseparable from the signified individual. In other words, the image becomes the individual. Jumping on down. So I go through analyses of 3 of Wilde's works: The Importance of Being Earnest, 2 of his essays from Intentions, which are critical essays that kind of give me more of a backbone for what I'm saying, and this idea of deliberate play of mask, and then I go into the picture of Dorian Gray. The third-person manipulation of identity by use of the mask provides the artist with a certain level of agency, but because the mask survives the artist, it ultimately becomes the artist, as demonstrated in the picture of Dorian Gray. In a letter to a friend from 1854, Wilde says of the 3 main characters, Basil Hallward is what I think I am, Lord Henry what the world thinks me, Dorian what I would like to be, in other ages perhaps. So in other words, Basil is the subjective or experiencing self, Henry is the perceived self, and Dorian is the ideal self. I'll add here that all 3 actors play a part in creating the mask. The remark in this letter leads to a complex interpretation of the novel as a text about identity and the mask. Wilde puts these 3 parts of his personality against each other in the opening scene. He then uses this moment to unify all 3 parts in the mask of the picture. The scene begins with Basil creating the picture and insisting that Henry that he has put too much of himself into it to display it publicly. Through the act of creation, the experiencing self has already become part of the mask. Dorian, the ideal self, is present in the mask at first only in resemblance, but later as a result of the wish. Basil repeatedly calls the picture the real Dorian, but only following the moment of transition when Dorian wishes for the image to age in his place. So this suggests that following the Faustian wish, the embodied representation of the ideal self trades places with the picture. And for the rest of the narrative until the end of the novel, Dorian's actions are performed from behind the mask of the picture that has superimposed itself onto the body. Finally, by tempting Dorian towards his Faustian wish and eventually serving as mentor to the picture superimposed onto the body, Henry, the perceived self, has also shaped the mask. When Dorian kills Basil, then, it's representative of the mask in the form of the ideal self destroying its creator. In the end, all 3 aspects of Wilde's identity are united when Dorian attempts to destroy the image, only to kill himself. The embodiment of the ideal self is revealed with the consequences of its actions evidenced on the body. The picture is restored to its original beauty, and the mask survives as an artifact in which the image of the ideal self, as crafted by the experiencing self and the perceived self, are forever merged in a fixed moment. And this is from my conclusion. This paper has attempted to address current anxieties about both gender identity and online identity by extracting Oscar Wilde's theories of dandyism from his life and work, to update those theories by looking at how rock musicians have used mass media to craft a public identity, and then to apply those adapted theories to the new media via a specific case study of Josh Tillman. In addition, it is asserted that rock deities are an especially powerful and ubiquitous force in the American and British music industries, and that in spite of changes in the ways that music is consumed and musicians' images are circulated, the rock deity and his work still exist as a virtual heterotopia, asking what is permissible and why, and providing the public a safe space to ponder the transgression of the heteronormative hegemony. To leave the reader with a cautionary note, while the divorce of mask/icon from the self is useful in forming a public identity, it's no replacement for more genuine personal relationships. As Haraway says, blasphemy protects one from the moral majority within, while still insisting on the need for community. If we are to blaspheme with our new dandiest cyborg technology in a manner consistent with the work of current feminist scholars, then irony and comedy of play ought always to be central. Thank you.